1984 is one of the most famous books of all time, probably because everybody's forced to read it in high school English class. Written by George Orwell, 1984 describes an absolutely totalitarian society, kinda like high school English class. But what if 1984 was real? Like, actually real? Well, let's explore the world of the book itself, then we'll try to figure out how 1984 actually could have come about, and how it would all end. And if you like this sort of thing, like and subscribe, and why not support the channel at patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Okay, so the world of 1984 is divided between three totalitarian superstates. There's Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia, which are locked in endless warfare. Oceania, which is strangely hard to pronounce, controls the Americas, Britain, Australia, and South Africa. Eurasia controls everything between Portugal and the Bering Strait, while East Asia controls, believe it or not, East Asia. Everything between these empires is up for grabs, constantly changing hands with the people used as chattel slaves. Life isn't much better inside the three empires though, because the empires brainwash their people to obey the state blindly. Those who work for the government are subjected to much greater scrutiny than the proletarian masses, however, which make up most of the population and unknowingly hold the keys to a better future if only they could get class consciousness. While each empire is armed with nukes, they won't use them because of mutually assured destruction. They learned that lesson after a nuclear war in the 1950s blew up a whole bunch of cities in Western Europe, the Americas, and Russia, and apparently just the British city of Colchester for some reason. Why Eurasia or whoever wouldn't nuke London is a bit of a mystery, which, you know what, I'll explain that in a bit. Anyways, instead by 1984, these three space-filling empires fight endless wars using special operations teams, conventional weapons, and floating fortresses out in the sea lanes. Nobody's ever gonna win the wars, since whenever somebody gets a leg up, the other two team up against them. Plus, geography, or in East Asia's case population, prevents the success of any major invasion. Not that the superstates want to win the wars, actually. The true purpose of these wars is to brainwash people and burn through resources so that society doesn't grow rich enough to challenge the status quo. How about the ideologies of these civilizations? Well, Oceania is driven by Ingsoc, or English socialism. Basically, Ingsoc is naked totalitarianism. The leaders of the party want absolute control over all aspects of society, from language to reproduction to thought itself. They justify this through the war against foreign powers and through propaganda about how bad capitalism was, but they're truly just power hungry. Ingsoc evolved out of the socialist movement of England, with its agents taking control apparently after the nuclear war in the 1950s. The main character of the book, Winston Smith, describes hiding in bunkers and confused street fighting occurring in London, Britain's own communist revolution maybe. One can only imagine that Queen Lizzie didn't last that long. The basic timeline comes right from the book, or at least a possibly biased in-universe book. Some theories say that only Oceania exists, or maybe it just controls Britain, kinda like a puffed up beans and toast North Korea. That's a legitimate theory, but I wonder if Oceania only controlled Britain, wouldn't it make more sense for the government to emphasize its Britishness, rather than stamp it out by renaming the island Airstrip 1 and basically dismissing it? The book's lore complicates everything by saying that Oceania originated when America absorbed the British Empire. So, therefore, we gotta imagine that English socialism is a subsidiary to a broader and more powerful American socialism. Let's call that AMSOC. As the book says, Oceania likes to give its various regions the feeling that they're the core of the empire so that nobody rebels. This is why Oceania hasn't any capital, and why Britain, despite being important to the book, is really just shrugged off by Oceania and renamed Airstrip 1. Since Winston Smith doesn't ever fly out of Airstrip 1, we don't really know much about the ideology or the state of the rest of the world. Nevertheless, sources in the book say that Eurasia came about when the Soviet Union conquered Europe. Its ideology is neo-Bolshevism, which is kind of like extreme Stalinism, we can imagine. So there's no Gorbachev in the situation, and not any Gorbachev Pizza Hut commercials.
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
East Asia is said to have risen out of the confused fighting in Asia about a decade after Eurasia and Oceania, so about 1970-1975. Its ideology is death worship, or the obliteration of the self, which to me seems kinda inspired by Zen Buddhism, So communism meets traditionalism, Maoist monks, with a pretty metal name. Okay, so that mostly checks out. Orwell was writing in 1948 when the Soviet Union was around and Mao Zedong was winning the Chinese Civil War, so in real life we already had 2 out of the 3 superstates from 1984. But there's one main issue: Oceania. Britain and the US completely rejected totalitarian ideologies in real life, despite being hit hard by the Great Depression. So if Oceania were to come about, at least American society would need to be really different. So how the heck could we get a commie America? Well, believe it or not, I just made a whole big video about this. Check it out if you want, but I'll summarize. Basically, America would need to be a pretty garbage place in the early 1900s, like doubly as bad. That way, the American Communist Party gets enough popular support to topple the government. In order for that to happen, you can't have the progressive movement, with Teddy Roosevelt and later FDR pressing through reforms which helped workers in the middle class, therefore decreasing the drive for revolution. Teddy Roosevelt was vice president when his president McKinley was shot to death. So if McKinley wasn't shot, or if he survived, then Roosevelt stays on as VP. Back in those days, being VP was worth as much as a jar of warm piss. That comes from VPs themselves. So Roosevelt never gets power, and the progressive movement never takes off. By the Great Depression in 1929, the American Communist Party is much more popular than in real life. Then, the economic downturn triggers political strife and revolution, kind of like Germany in real life. Communists launch a revolution, and after winning a civil war, take control of America, with their leader William Zebulon Foster taking charge as chairman and crafting a totalitarian state. Okay, so we have the foundations for 1984, but one big obstacle remains: Europe and Britain. That's one, because they're the same place. In real life, the US and the Soviet Union split Europe basically in half, with Western Europe being democratic and capitalist, and Eastern Europe being authoritarian and communist. But in the book, Europe is ruled wholly by Eurasia except for Britain, so we need to kind of change around what happens in World War II. Adolf Hitler, we can say, still rises to power and invades Poland in 1939. While Britain would probably still declare war on Germany with France, it would then back out when France falls due to the fact that communist America would invade Canada as soon as possible, probably early 1940. Canada is aided by British soldiers and attempts to ward off the waves of the American Red Army. While the major cities of Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal fall, Canadian forces continue guerrilla fighting in the icy northern forests. Eventually, they're beaten to dust. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union, washing across the plains of Eastern Europe like a forest fire. Germany takes key border cities and launches an immense purge of local people, the largest mass killing in human history so far. Communist America is at first unable to deliver aid to Russia because of the British naval blockade. However, American industrial prowess means that after a prolonged campaign, it sinks the Royal Navy to the bottom of the Atlantic and even begins to bombard the British Isles. American soldiers hop from Canada to Greenland to Iceland and plan a gargantuan land invasion of the British Isles, just in time for Pearl Harbor. Like real life, the Japanese Empire launches a surprise attack against America, shredding the American fleet in Hawaii, then seizing control of the Philippines for its natural resources. Forced to move its army elsewhere, Communist America accepts an armistice with the United Kingdom, then sends its fleet through the Panama Canal to the Pacific Ocean, clashing with the Japanese Navy in dozens of battles. Conscripted American soldiers island hop across the Pacific Isles, with both sides using brutal human wave tactics in dense jungles and sun-scorched beaches. Gradually, though, America expands. In Europe, the Soviet Union stops the German advance at the gates of the starving cities of Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow. Then, with a gargantuan effort, begins to wrestle back the Nazi war machine, grinding through mud and ruins of once populous cities. In Asia, Communist America looms over Japan, plotting an immense million-man attack on the home isles. America probably still invents the nuclear bomb eventually, but let's say it's delayed a year due to political purges of American scientists. Instead, America obliterates Japan using the traditional means, burning down nearly every standing structure in months upon months of firebombing. The ceaseless conflagration incinerates Japan's farmlands, bringing mass famine. Imagine Stalingrad 100 times over. Finally, the American army invades, sweeping a withered Japanese army which has survived mostly on bark and human flesh. Back in Europe, the Soviet Union struggles onward, liberating Kiev, Minsk, then reaching the suburbs of Warsaw. But it slows to a stop on the Vistula River, where Germany's slave soldiers clash with the conscripted proletariat in the scabbed ruins of Poland. But the Soviet Union gets access to the wonder weapon before Germany, the nuclear bomb. At first, the Soviet Union uses artillery to launch nuclear bombs into German-controlled cities, incinerating Königsberg. But as the Luftwaffe falls apart, Soviet planes plunge into the heart of Germany, turning Berlin, Nuremberg, Vienna, and Munich to smoldering ash. Nazi Germany splinters and Hitler flees to Spain. The Red Army rampages across Germany, then takes Vichy France and Fascist Italy too. The Second World War ends in 1947 with dozens upon dozens of millions of people dead. Europe is ruled mostly by the Soviet Union, while North America flies its own red banner controlled by the Communist Party of America. Now, at first, Russia and America have a honeymoon period. Both are communist and they just beat the Axis powers. But if there's one thing in the world that communists hate more than capitalists, it's other communists. In real life, the Soviet Union devoted great effort to purging the Communist Party over and over again over basically dumb, doctrinal disagreements. Likewise, the Soviet Union and Communist China became enemies and even fought a border war. So, Russia and America would probably sour quickly on each other as a result of political disagreement, like how closely America should follow Soviet policies or something like that. We could imagine that Chairman Foster, who liked Stalin a whole lot, gets forcibly retired in a coup by his right-hand man, the mustachioed Earl Browder, who was much more America-centric than Stalin-centric. In real life, Browder and Foster feuded for leadership of the American Communist Party, just like in this scenario. Browder's mustache does align with a certain mustachioed elder sibling too, so there's that. Plus, there's actual pragmatic geopolitical interests which leverage the two great powers against each other, like the Soviet Union and the US grew to hate each other due to Cold War political competition, as well as, ideology. Just like in real life, the first major flashpoint happens in Korea, where the feuding factions of the Korean Communist Party can't agree on who to select as their chairman. In real life, the Soviet Union was the only major communist power, so it basically forced in their guy Kim Il-sung. Once in power, Kim purged everyone who opposed him, including the previous chairman, Pak Hun-young. But let's say that in this timeline, America backs Pak, resulting in a political feud in Korea, combined with Russian and American military presence. Finally, in 1950, civil war erupts between the competing factions. At first, Russia and America try to stay neutral, but mutual distrust and competing compelling interests pull the two superstates into a whirlpool. Both excommunicate each other from the holy halls of true communism and denounce the other as social fascists, which must be liquidated. The war spreads across the globe, with American and Russian navies clashing in the Yellow and the Norwegian seas. That means Pyongyang, Seoul, Vladivostok, Amsterdam, and Bordeaux get leveled. Britain struggles to stay afloat in the tempest. If you remember, they were nearly invaded by America, but stayed neutral afterward. Both America and Russia guarantee the neutrality of Britain, but when the British government provides minor aid to America, maybe helping stranded sailors, the Soviet Union drops a nuclear bomb on the city of Colchester and forces them to stay absolutely neutral. This triggers a revolution in Britain, in which workers and mutinying soldiers, led by the Communist Party of Great Britain, seize power in the name of English socialism. The country manages to stay neutral despite the Colchester incident, but the people hate Eurasia. Once in charge, the communists purge British society in a rampage against intellectuals, minorities, and royals. The royal family, with nowhere to go, is publicly hanged. America and Russia continue the Third World War for over a decade, with Communist America getting the upper hand and even making a land invasion of Soviet-occupied Spain. As American soldiers march on Paris in January 1960, the Soviet Union launches its nuclear arsenal on the tips of dozens upon dozens of newly engineered missiles developed by captured Nazi scientists. The aim isn't perfect, but New York, Chicago, and Boston are demolished. Chairman Browder is nearly killed, but a whole swath of communist leaders are. In retaliation, America launches its own imperfect missiles, striking Moscow, Leningrad, and Minsk. Russia prepares for a retaliation, but desperate phone calls between Chairman Browder and Chairman Beria bring about the unexpected, a ceasefire. It goes against the prevailing instincts, but rationality, in a moment when human extinction looms closer than ever, triumphs. Rather than destroy the world, the two superpowers agree to split it between them. They meet in a series of conferences in Lisbon and agree that America should get the Western Hemisphere and Britain, aka Oceania, while Russia gets Eurasia. The Third World War finally comes to a close, but the fighting isn't quite done. In the early 1960s, the great powers consolidate their empires. Oceania, armed with a gargantuan land force and hungry for violence following the nuclear war, pillages through Mexico and Central America. Eurasia, in turn, occupies the oil-producing lands in the Middle East and plunges deep into East Asia, using a generation of European men hungry for revenge in any form. The Communist Party of America renames itself to the American Socialist Party, or AMSOC for short. It cements its rule over the core population through a gargantuan network of spies, informants, and audio bugs. Eurasia does the same. Chairman Beria defines the ideology of the party as Neo-Bolshevism, which advocates for absolute government control over all aspects of society in the name of the proletariat, of course. In 1964, Oceania at last enforces its claim over Britain. It isn't so much of an invasion as a corporate takeover. The ruling clique of the British Communist Party is overthrown. Goldstein, Jones, Aronson, Rutherford, and they're brought to trial in America. The new leaders of the local party, which takes the name INGSOC, pledge loyalty to Chairman Browder, their big brother, and purge society of anyone who could possibly present a challenge to them. As the 1960s turns to the 1970s, Oceania extends its rule into South America. While the country is technically run from New York, the people beyond the core don't know this and are deceived into believing they're part of a multinational confederation of brotherly communists. The Communist Party of Mexico rules in Mexico, the Communist Party of Brazil rules in Brazil, and so on, but Americans actually call the shots in the end because they have the most guns. Local languages are okay, but party elites learn the fashionable tongue of America. In order to help the proliferation of the English language and, of course, to block the communication of anti-communist ideas, Newspeak is thought up, a butchered and simplified version of English which the party aims to completely replace all the old languages of the world by the 2050s. The newly conquered lands are rife for exploitation, with Oceania using armed force to enforce a system of slavery and a conscription regime to fuel the expansionistic war machine. Conditions aren't absolutely horrible for everybody though. Sure, everybody has to work and gets paid a meager wage, but as long as you live in a well-off area and don't cause too much trouble, you can survive. The working class, the proles, are kept docile through alcohol, drugs, lotteries, and violent TV films. Patriotism is inculcated through party newspapers and propaganda reels. While the proles hold the keys to the downfall of Oceania, the party is more concerned with itself. It ceaselessly surveils, brainwashes, and deceives its own party members, who are the educated class, who could conceivably lead a revolution. In fact, the party has such absolute control that nobody except the inner sanctum of the party knows that Chairman Earl Browder died in 1973. Therefore, the party uses the immortal image of Big Brother, but power is held instead by a junta of bureaucrats. In the mid-1970s, the system sees its first major challenge, the rise of the cult of the obliteration of the self in China. This revolutionary force takes up arms against Eurasia, but basically has the same totalitarian ideology with a traditional Buddhist twist. The cult forges the People's Republic of East Asia, with its gargantuan armies pushing Eurasia back to Mongolia and Manchuria. This revolution is of course an opportunity for Oceania, which strikes in a major attack against Eurasian bases across the planet. However, the war quickly slows to a stop. Eurasian citadels block all advances into its core territory, and no one is willing to use nukes again. The war comes to a close in 1978, with East Asia becoming the next of the great powers. In 1980, East Asia launches a daring attack against Japan, taking the southern parts from Oceania with the secret aid of Eurasia. Elsewhere, Eurasia helps Oceania against East Asia. At this point, the wars led by the great powers have taken a different shape. They no longer aim for true victory, but instead are ritualistic in nature. Nobody expects to win. Instead, they want to burn through resources to keep the levels of population down and the standard of living down as well. Outside the powers, the Fourth World struggles for independence. In North Africa, Islamists take control of the Sahel between the frontiers of Eurasia and Oceania, but this new caliphate is just a plaything for the superstates. In the early 1980s, the powers joust against each other in ritualistic combat. Oceania is at war with Eurasia, then East Asia again, then Eurasia, then East Asia, and so on. That's when the book takes place. So what happens next? Well, no system can last forever, especially systems which are based upon not only the delusion of their subjects, but also their operators. The party insiders of Oceania and the other major states, put simply, cannot govern a country on lies and brainwashing. That's why the leaders of the Soviet Union in real life had no idea how the country was actually doing. Gorbachev thought everything was fine until all of a sudden the military locked him in his house and the Soviet Union split apart. Same thing with Nazi Germany, which was so deluded to invade the Soviet Union, declare war on America, and devote needed war supplies to massacring civilians. Hitler thought the war could be won until his last hours alive. So how exactly would Oceania and its pals collapse? Well, I think it would take place gradually over the course of decades and consist of the following three forces. The first is inside party feuding. In empires as big as Oceania and Eurasia, the parties of the many regions are just not going to agree on policies, especially when it comes to leadership transitions. When one generation of leaders dies off and another takes its place, there will be schisms and secessions in the parties over who exactly should lead the party for the next generation. These will also have a regionalist bent, with local identities returning to the fore, especially in comparison to the distant elites of New York. That's the second force. Expect Brazil and Mexico to split from Oceania, and France and Germany from Eurasia. Likewise, the regions between the empires will get stronger and stronger. Places like India, the Middle East, and Africa might just shrug off their oppressors over time, winning their independence. But that's just the states themselves fragmenting, not the totalitarian ideology dissipating. For that to go, you need populist uprisings, like those that happened in the 1990s in communist Europe. As resources become scarce as a result of economic mismanagement or wars, the proles will rise up in protest of poor conditions. This will gradually reignite the class consciousness of the people. I don't think it'll happen all at once. France became a monarchy again after the French Revolution, for example. But I think by the 2080s at least, Oceania and maybe Eurasia will fall to repeated revolutions, gradually developing democracies of their own. Now, these wouldn't really look similar to our democracy. Parties would probably be banned, and local councillors would have much more power than any central government. The malevolent authoritarianism of 1984 is gradually chipped away until we get the opposite, benevolent anarchism in 2084. But that's just a theory. What do you think happens after 1984?